When I arrived at my son-in-law's building grand opening wearing clothes stained with oil and grease, he looked at me and sneered in disgust. This old man looked so cheap. He humiliated me in front of all the investors and the city's elite gathered in the room. But he had no idea that just minutes later, the billion-dollar building would plunge into darkness, and the only person who could save it would be me. Hello everyone, welcome to today's story. Before we return to the moment I was humiliated at the building's grand opening, please like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. What would you do in that situation? Note this is a fictional story. Some details are dramatized to create meaningful and beneficial reflections. You're not just late, Elias. You're a liability. Julian Sinclair's voice sliced through the 85th floor lounge like a cold razor, turning every head in the room toward my oil-stained shirt. I stood there. Elias Thorne, a 60-year-old master electrician, with hands that had wired half the skyscrapers in the loop, feeling like a grit-stained ghost in a palace of glass. The ultra-modern Apex Lounge was a blinding sea of white marble and recessed LED strips that made my eyes ache. I looked down at my palms, where the rough texture of black grease still clung to my calloused skin and under my fingernails. Julian Sinclair, 38, a partner at a prestigious venture capital firm, adjusted his $10,000 watch with a smirk that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He stood at the center of the room, a perfect specimen of Chicago's elite, in a tailored tuxedo that probably cost more than my first truck. The sharp, acrid scent of hydraulic fluid on my sleeve was a direct assault on the expensive perfume and aged bourbon hanging in the air. The rhythmic clinking of crystal glasses stopped, abruptly replaced by a silence so heavy I could hear the hum of the high-voltage transformers 3 floors below. "Do you have any idea what this night represents for Sterling Tech?" Julian asked, his voice low, but carrying to the furthest corner of the panoramic windows. "Look at you. You look like you crawled out of a sewer." I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, my mind still flashing back to the cold concrete of the parking garage and the woman's terrified eyes. 85 floors up, and all I could smell was the South Side oil on my skin. I didn't belong. Julian made sure of that with a single sharp laugh. It was a calculated verbal audit, performed in front of the very power brokers I had once hoped to impress for my daughter's sake. Julian gestured broadly to the floor-to-ceiling windows where the city lights sprawled out like a motherboard. "This is a billion-dollar launch, Elias. There is no room for Southside sentimentality or industrial accidents here." He stepped closer, his presence a wall of expensive cologne and suppressed rage. "He told me that Beatrice deserves a father who adds value to her brand, not one who drips grease on a 5-figure rug." I tried to find my voice to tell him about the malfunction in P3 and the manual override I had to pull with my bare hands to keep a life from being snuffed out in a silent Tesla. But Julian cut me off with a sneer that made my years of honest labor feel like a criminal record. "How do you tell a man who measures worth in stock options that you just saved a life at the cost of a white shirt?" I realized then that I wasn't an invited guest in his eyes. I was a malfunction in his carefully curated evening. He leaned in his voice, a whisper that only I could hear, yet it felt louder than any shout. He told me that I should have stayed in Bridgeport, where the shadows hide the grime. Then came the final blow, the one that made the polished floor feel like it was giving way beneath my boots. Julian informed me that he wasn't just acting on his own whims. He claimed that Beatrice had specifically requested he handle me if I showed up looking like a working-class ghost. As Julian's finger pointed at the smudge on my sleeve, I realized he wasn't just speaking for himself, he was quoting my daughter. I looked at Beatrice, waiting for the girl I'd raised on grease-stained paychecks to stand up and bridge the gap between her husband's cruelty and the truth. Beatrice Thorne Vance, my 32-year-old daughter, looked every bit the polished executive in her designer silk, though her eyes darted away from me with the frantic energy of someone trying to hide a visible scar. The clinical cold blue of the LED lighting, reflected off her silver dress, making her appear as metallic and unyielding as the skyscrapers I'd spent 40 years bringing to life. I felt a surge of bitter irony when she didn't rush to my side. She was the one who had instructed security to keep unsavory types out of this billion-dollar launch, never imagining that the net she cast would snag her own father. I stepped forward, my heavy boots leaving faint, dark smudges on the pristine floor that Julian guarded so fiercely. "B, it is me," I said, my voice sounding rough and alien in this temple of glass. "I had an accident in the garage helping someone. A woman was trapped B. I had to reach the manual release. I waited for the recognition for the daughter who used to hand me a cold beer after a 12-hour shift at the substation. Instead, I watched her jaw tighten. Julian Sinclair stood beside her with a predatory grin, enjoying the spectacle as if it were a high-stakes negotiation he had already closed. B just looked at the black hydraulic fluid on my sleeve, her nose wrinkling as the acrid scent began to mix with her expensive French perfume. Her silence was a heavy, wet blanket smothering the 30 years of fatherhood I'd poured into her soul until there was nothing left but cold ash. I wanted to tell her that the woman in the garage was terrified, that I was the only one who heard her thumping against the glass, but the words died in my throat. Beatrice finally spoke, her voice a sharp, clinical instrument. "Dad, please, just look at yourself." She hissed, the sound barely audible over the hum of the climate control. "You are embarrassing Julian in front of the entire board. You're ruining the aesthetic he has worked years to build." I felt the floor tilt. It wasn't just about the grease. It was about the lie. Have you ever seen your own flesh and blood look at you like you were a stain on an otherwise perfect life? It's a coldness that no winter in Chicago can match. She leaned in, her eyes fixed on a point just past my shoulder. "Take the service elevator in the back. Now. Before someone takes a photo and posts it on a blog." I looked at the cold, stainless steel of the elevator call button she was pointing toward. It was the exit for the janitors, the caterers, and the ghosts. As I stood there defeated by the very girl I'd shielded from every hardship, she admitted the final crushing truth. She had told Julian I was a retired consultant, crafting a sanitized history, because she was too ashamed to admit her father was a master electrician who lived by the sweat of his brow. I turned away, the hum of the heavy service elevator doors sounding like a funeral march. As the doors began to slide shut, I caught a glimpse of Julian leaning in to whisper a victory in my daughter's ear, and she was nodding. The descent felt less like an elevator ride, and more like being buried alive in a stainless steel coffin, the numbers on the display ticking down as if counting the final seconds of my dignity. As the heavy doors slid shut, sealing me away from the warmth and light of the gala, the image of Julian leaning in to whisper a victory in my daughter's ear burned behind my eyelids. She had nodded. That small silver thread movement of her head was the last connection I had to the woman I thought I knew. I stood alone in the flickering fluorescent glare of the service lift, surrounded by a heavy gray mop bucket, industrial cleaning supplies, and the suffocatingly sterile scent of bleach and lavender air freshener. The elevator vibrated with a low rhythmic thrum, the sound of the building's massive HVAC system struggling against the Chicago winter. My eyes drifted to a clipboard hanging on the metal wall near the buttons. It was a printed banned list for the evening's security staff. My heart stopped when I saw my own name at the very top, typed in bold, clinical font. Julian hadn't just reacted to my appearance tonight. He had anticipated my failure weeks ago, setting the trap before I even knew there was a game to play. I touched the pocket where the mysterious business card from the garage sat, but my fingers felt numb, as if the cold from the steel walls was leaching into my marrow. Just a ghost in the wires. I whispered to the mirrored wall, watching a man I barely recognized stare back with oil-darkened eyes and a shattered expression. 85 floors. That's how far I fell. Not in feet, but in the estimation of the person I'd once taught to ride a bike. The gravity of the situation was a physical weight, pressing me down toward the foundation of a building I helped bring to life, yet was no longer permitted to inhabit. When the doors finally opened on the ground floor, I stepped out into the side lobby, a cavernous space of glass and shadow. The distant, high-pitched ringing of my own ears was the only greeting I received. I walked toward the heavy brass handles of the exit, the low thrum of the building's machinery echoing in my chest like a dying pulse. As I reached the door, the cold Chicago wind began to howl through the cracks in the glass, a mournful sound that carried the weight of 1,000 lost promises. I heard Margaret's voice, then clear as a bell in the quiet of my mind. She always knew when my resolve was fraying. "Hold your head up, Elias," she seemed to say. "Thorn men don't bend for the wind. When does a daughter stop being a daughter and start being a stranger with your last name?" I paused at the door handle, realizing that the promise I made to Margaret was the only thing I had left in this city of mirrors. I reached into my pocket, not for the card this time, but for the heavy serrated edge of the master key override for the entire building's main grid. Julian had been so focused on my dirty shirt that he'd forgotten I still held the keys to his kingdom. I gripped the brass handle of the exit, but as the first flake of snow touched my hand, the world began to blur and bleed into the gray morning of 5 years ago. The modern glass and steel of the lobby vanished, replaced by the sterile antiseptic smell of a place where no master key could ever fix the damage. The rhythmic mechanical chirp of the heart monitor was the only thing keeping the silence of the hospital room from swallowing me whole. As I stood in that lobby 5 years later, the lobby's brass handle felt like it dissolved into the papery, cool texture of my wife's hand. Margaret Thorne, my wife of 32 years, lay beneath the thin hospital sheets, her vibrant spirit now a flickering candle struggling against the draft of a failing heart. I watched the winter sun struggle to pierce the heavy Chicago overcast outside the window of Mercy Hospital. I have spent my life mastering circuits, balancing loads, and ensuring that the power grid never falters. But in that sterile room, I felt the ultimate powerlessness of an empty battery. The flickering, fluorescent hum of the hospital hallway seen through the cracked door felt like a taunt, a reminder that the world's machinery kept turning while mine was grinding to a permanent halt. Margaret's eyes fluttered open, searching the room with a hazy desperation. "Beatrice," she whispered, her voice barely a thread. "Is she at the library?" I squeezed her hand gently, trying to ground her. "She is coming, Margaret. Just rest." She smiled, then a small, knowing curve of her lips that broke my heart. "I know about the secret savings, Elias, for her college. I thought it was a surprise, a little stash I'd kept from my overtime shifts to ensure our daughter never had to beg for a future. But Margaret always had a way of seeing through my wiring. Margaret's hand felt like a bird with a broken wing, fragile, shivering, and destined for a sky I couldn't reach. "Don't let her see the world the way we did, Elias," she urged, her grip tightening with a final desperate surge of energy. "Make it bright for her. Promise me. Promise she will be more than us." The overpowering, sterile scent of antiseptic and stale coffee seemed to thicken in my lungs. I looked at the woman who had been my North Star since our Bridgeport beginnings, back when we shared a one-bedroom apartment and a single dream. "I will take care of her, Margaret." I vowed, my voice thick with a grief I couldn't yet name. "She will have everything we did not. I will be her shield. I'll make sure she never has to know the coldness of an empty cupboard or the weight of a debt she can't pay." You never forget the smell of a hospital room when it becomes the finish line of a 30-year race. It smells like bleach and stolen time. I watched her breathing become shallow, a stuttering rhythm that no manual override could fix. In my desperation to give her peace, I committed myself to a path I didn't yet understand. To keep that promise of a bright life for Beatrice, I knew I would have to take on every double shift, every emergency call-out, and every hazardous overtime hour the union could offer. I didn't realize that in becoming the provider of her light, I was signing away the years where I could have been present to actually see it shine. I was promising to be the foundation, but a foundation is often buried in the dark, so the house can stand in the sun. The line on the monitor went flat, a long, unwavering tone that signaled the end of my marriage and the beginning of a debt I'd spent 5 years trying to pay in blood and overtime. I stood there holding a hand that was already losing its warmth, the mechanical scream of the EKG marking the exact moment my world went dark. The crushing silence of the Bridgeport house after the funeral had been a physical weight, a darkness that no amount of industrial lighting could ever truly dispel. But 5 months after we buried Margaret, I stood on the manicured lawn of Northwestern University, my hands still smelling of industrial copper, and my heart heavy with the secret cost of the diploma Beatrice was about to hold. The vibrant purple and white of the graduation gowns looked like a royal tapestry against the emerald green lawn of Evanston. I shifted uncomfortably, the stiff collar of my only off-the-rack blazer biting into my neck. I realized then that Beatrice hadn't just been buried in her textbooks. She had been carefully curating her world. She had been hiding a man named Julian from me for months, shielding him from the Bridgeport awkwardness until she could stand on the other side of that stage with a degree as her armor. I watched her cross the stage in May 2021, her stride confident and her head held high. "I did it, Margaret," I whispered to the wind. "She's standing where we never could." I thought of the brutal 16-hour shifts at the substation and the double mortgage papers sitting on my kitchen table that had paid for every credit hour. While the parents around me wore bespoke suits and spoke of summering in the Hamptons, I felt the rough calluses on my palms like a brand. I had successfully shielded her from my world of grit and high-voltage wire, but in doing so I had made myself a stranger in hers. "Dad, did you see me?" "I'm finally out," Beatrice exclaimed, as she pushed through the crowd toward me, her face glowing. A degree in marketing. It cost me 3 fingers' worth of feeling in my left hand from an old circuit blow. Was it a fair trade? I wanted to believe it was. Before I could pull her into a proper hug, she turned toward a man who had been waiting just behind her. "Dad, I want you to meet Julian." Julian Sinclair stepped forward from behind her, a man in his late 30s who carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never been told, "No." His tailored charcoal suit was impeccable, his handshake firm but performative, and when he smiled, it was the kind of expression that belonged in a boardroom negotiation, rather than a family introduction. "Julian is at Sterling Tech, Dad. He's already a partner." Beatrice said, her voice carrying a pitch of pride I hadn't heard before. "Charming," Julian said, his eyes scanning my weathered face and the faint staining of electrical solder that never truly left my cuticles. "You have the look of a man who really knows his way around a physical toolbox. So authentic." Ever notice how the rich use the word authentic as a polite way of saying poor? The instant class friction was like a live wire humming between us. He spoke of Beatrice's potential in the tech world as if she were a commodity he had recently acquired. He mentioned that his family owned several heritage properties in the city, the kind of grand old buildings where men like me are usually only seen through the service entrance. He wasn't looking at a father. He was looking at the maintenance staff in the grand Sinclair narrative. Julian smiled, a perfect toothy display of Ivory Coast luxury, then wiped his palm on a silk handkerchief after shaking my hand as if my hard-earned life was something contagious. Julian Sinclair sat at the head of the restaurant table like a king presiding over a court where I didn't speak the language. His words a dizzying blur of disruption and scalability that made my Bridgeport life feel like a faded relic. As I sat there, still feeling the phantom silk of the handkerchief he'd used to wipe away my handshake, I realized this celebratory dinner was more than a meal. It was an audit. Julian was testing the load-bearing capacity of my social grace, watching to see if the master electrician could sit in a high-end Chicago steakhouse without blowing a fuse and embarrassing the rising star on his arm. The candlelight glinted off Julian's silver cufflinks as he leaned forward, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of clinking silver and hushed power plays. He lectured Beatrice on venture capital and the post-labor economy, a world where wealth was generated by algorithms rather than sweat. I tried to find a connection. a way to contribute to the current flowing between them. I mentioned my years working on the city's primary power grid, explaining the physical reality of how Chicago stays lit during a blizzard. Julian simply gave me a patronizing smile, the kind you give a child, explaining how a toy works. The legacy systems you work on are fascinating, Elias, he said, swirling a glass of aged bourbon that smelled like charred oak and old money. It's like looking at a museum of the industrial age. Beatrice didn't jump to my defense. Instead, she tapped a note into her phone, hanging on his every word. Julian is right, Dad, she said without looking up. The future is about data architecture, not just wires. Watching Beatrice try on Julian's vocabulary was like watching a master painter try to use a sledgehammer, clunky, forced, and painful to witness. She was actively rewiring her own history. When a passing colleague of Julian's stopped by, Beatrice sat up straighter, her posture mimicry in its purest form. She didn't mention the South Side or the sound of the trains that used to rattle our windows. We grew up near the park, Julian, she said, her voice adopting a soft suburban lilt I'd never heard before. Lots of green space. I felt a sharp pang in my chest, a heartbreak, at the erasure of our shared history. I'm just worried you're losing your voice, B, I managed to say when the colleague moved on. You don't sound like yourself. Have you ever felt the air go thin in a room just because you were the only one who knew how to actually build the walls around you? Julian and Beatrice shared a look, a silent communication that excluded me entirely. I was being managed a secret kept in the basement, while the party raged upstairs. The scratchy, unfamiliar linen of the oversized white napkin felt like sandpaper against my calloused fingers. As the meal ended, the sharp, rhythmic clicking of Beatrice's new high heels on the marble floor sounded like a countdown. She pulled me aside near the coat check, the smell of expensive cigars heavy in the air. Dad, please, she whispered, her eyes darting toward Julian. Next time we meet his partners, could you not wear your work jacket? The industrial aesthetic makes them uncomfortable. She didn't look me in the eye when she asked me to hide who I was. She just adjusted her new pearl necklace and followed Julian into the night, leaving me with a bill I couldn't afford and a silence I couldn't break. The wrought iron gates of the Sinclair estate didn't just open. They yawned, exposing a driveway of crushed limestone that crunched under my old truck's tires like the bones of the working class. Driving onto that property felt like crossing a border into a country where my passport was permanently expired. I was still carrying the weight of that dinner in the city, the silence I couldn't break, and the bill I could barely afford. I shifted my truck into park, the engine's rattle sounding like a protest against the manicured silence of Lake Forest. I was here for a Sunday brunch, but I felt like a technician called in to fix a leak in a palace. Meredith Sinclair, 62, clutched her pearls with a practiced drama as she stared at the grease on the Persian rug as if it were a personal assault on her soul. She met me in the foyer with a smile that was perfectly aligned, but lacked any heat, much like the marble floors beneath my boots. You must be Elias, she said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that felt processed. Beatrice told us you were very hands-on with your work. I felt the scrutiny like a high-voltage probe. I'm a master electrician, ma'am, I replied, keeping my voice level and my posture straight. I keep the lights on and the power flowing. I realized quickly that Beatrice had done her own version of load balancing before I arrived. She had coached the Sinclairs to avoid any mention of our neighborhood or the struggles we faced after Margaret died, effectively erasing my history before I even sat down at their table. Meredith led us to a sun-drenched patio, where every piece of sterling silver glinted with an aggressive military precision. Meredith's voice was like a silk garrote, soft to the touch, but designed to cut off your air before you realized you were being strangled. She steered the conversation toward the noble simplicity of manual labor, making it sound like a hobby rather than a life of grit and specialized knowledge. Julian and Beatrice stayed silent. My daughter focused entirely on her eggs, Benedict, as if the hollandaise held the secrets to her new life. When Meredith asked about my interests, I mentioned my workshop and my passion for restoring vintage electrical equipment, the heartbeat of the old city. She gave a small, airy laugh that made my blood simmer. A quaint little trade habit, I suppose, she said, sipping her mimosa. It's so refreshing to meet someone who still uses their physical strength for a living. It's almost prehistoric, isn't it? Have you ever sat at a table where the salt was worth more than your first car? Yet you felt like the only thing in the room that was actually real. I gripped the heavy cold silverware in my hand, my knuckles turning white. There is nothing prehistoric about a power grid, Mrs. Sinclair? I said, my voice tight. Without it, your smart house is just a very expensive pile of bricks in the dark. Meredith didn't blink. She just tilted her head as if I were a curious specimen in a glass jar. She mentioned she had already started redecorating Beatrice's future tastes, implying my influence was a set of old drapes being systematically removed. Meredith leaned back, her diamond rings flashing in the morning sun, and said with a terrifyingly sweet tilt of her head, "We'll have to make sure Beatrice's wedding doesn't feel too Bridgeport." I looked at my daughter, but she wouldn't meet my eyes, and I knew the battle for her soul was being fought with weapons I didn't even own. I stood at the teller window in Bridgeport, the air smelling of stale coffee and industrial heaters. As I watched the bank clerk count out 80 crisp $100 bills, the ghost of Margaret's engagement ring, and 3 years of double shifts. I had promised Margaret that I would be the shield for Beatrice, but standing in that dim bank, I felt more like a man selling the foundation of his house to keep the roof from leaking. It was April, that wet Chicago spring that never quite feels like a beginning. Meredith Sinclair had made it clear during that brunch in Lake Forest that anything less than perfection was an insult to their lineage. And Beatrice had come to me crying about a gown she couldn't afford on her entry-level salary. She told me Julian's family would judge her, that she'd look like a pauper next to the Sinclair women. So I reached into the emergency fund that was supposed to be my own safety net. "It's for the dress B," I told her later that evening, handing her a plain white envelope in the quiet of my kitchen. "The one you said Meredith liked." She took the money with a mix of relief and a fleeting guilty shame that she quickly suppressed behind a practiced smile. "Dad, you shouldn't have," she whispered, though her fingers gripped the envelope tight. "Julian's parents have so much. I just didn't want to look like I didn't belong. I made her swear to secrecy. I didn't want Julian to feel obligated to a Southside electrician, or worse, for him to pity me." She told me a few days later she had lost the envelope and had to use her own credit. A story that didn't sit right until I saw Julian months later wearing a new designer watch that cost exactly $8,000. Ever feel like you're paying the admission price for your own disappearance? $8,000. That's a lot of copper wire to buy a seat in the back row. June 2022 arrived with a heat that made the Chicago Botanic Garden shimmer like a mirage. It was a sea of white orchids and high society whispers. My suit felt 10 years too old, the scratchy polyester lining biting into my shoulders as I walked Beatrice down the aisle. She was beautiful in that lace, but she felt like a stranger under my arm. As soon as the vows were exchanged, I was moved. "Table 14, sir," a young man in a stiff waistcoat told me, pointing toward a spot hidden behind a massive marble pillar near the kitchen doors. "I can barely see her from here," I muttered, but the boy was already gone. I sat there as the sound of industrial dishwashers clattered behind the service door, the cloying scent of 5,000 roses fighting the sharp smell of dish soap. In a garden of orchids, I was the only weed. I walked her down the aisle, and then I became a ghost. I looked at the formal wedding program on the table and felt a cold stone settle in my gut. My name was gone. There was no mention of the father of the bride, only a generic line thanking the bride's family for their support. I sat at that table, the smell of expensive salmon and kitchen trash mixing in my nose, as I watched Julian raise a glass to a family that apparently didn't include the man who paid for the bride's gown. The daughter I knew, the one who used to hand me wrenches in our Bridgeport garage and didn't mind the grease under her nails, was disappearing beneath layers of designer silk and a voice that didn't belong to her. I stood by the kitchen doors, the clatter of industrial dishwashers, a rhythmic mockery of the high society whispers filling the ballroom. Julian's father stood at the podium, his voice booming through the speakers as he celebrated Beatrice's refinement and her seamless transition into the Sinclair lineage. He spoke as if she had been born in a Lake Forest cradle, completely ignoring the man who had paid for her very first pair of shoes and the heavy lace she was currently wearing. When the announcer called for the father-daughter dance, I felt a surge of ancient pride that was quickly smothered by the clinical atmosphere of the Chicago Botanic Garden. I took her hand, but it felt cold and limp in mine, lacking the warmth of the child who once fell asleep against my shoulder after a double shift. The professional cameras flashed around us, blurring the world into a disorienting white haze, while the upbeat generic wedding band music drowned out any chance of a real conversation. I leaned in, trying to find a crack in her new polished armor. "Your mother would have loved this garden bee," I whispered, hoping the memory of Margaret would ground her. She looked at me, but her eyes were already darting toward Julian and his parents, searching for approval. "Please, Dad, not now." She hushed her voice, a sharp, clinical edge. "Julian's investors are watching. We have to look the part. It's about the Sinclair legacy now." As we swayed, she leaned closer, but not for affection. She admitted she hadn't just lost that envelope of cash I gave her. She had handed it to Julian, telling him to take the credit for the gown, so his parents would think he was providing for her properly. 30 years of being a father reduced to a 3-minute dance and a polite nod from a son-in-law who didn't even know my middle name. I felt like a hired hand in my own daughter's life, a temporary fixture being phased out by a more efficient model. The expensive, cloying scent of champagne and over-perfumed guests began to choke me, making the air feel as thin as the promises Julian had made. I watched the elite crowd move with a practiced grace that I could never emulate their laughter, a language I wasn't meant to speak. I realized then that the more Beatrice embraced this Sinclair aesthetic, the more she had to erase the man who built her foundation. I couldn't stay for the cake cutting. I couldn't stay to watch them toast to a future that had no room for me. I found her near the partners' table, her face a mask of social exhaustion. "I'm going to head out, Beatrice." I said the words, feeling like a surrender. "I think I've seen enough." She didn't look surprised or disappointed. "Oh, okay," she replied, already looking past me. "Julian's driver can get you a cab. We're a bit busy with the partners right now." How do you keep loving someone who is busy burying every version of you that they once knew? I walked out into the cool night air, headed for the parking lot. My heart stopped when I saw it near the dumpster. The handmade hope chest I had built with my own hands as a wedding gift was sitting in the trash, discarded, because it didn't match the modern minimalist theme of their registry. I drove away with the image of that wood, my hands' work, my heart's gift, abandoned in the debris, realizing that my daughter hadn't just moved away. She had evicted me from her life. In Bridgeport, silence isn't just the absence of noise. It's a heavy, physical presence that settles into the corners of a house once filled with the smell of Margaret's cooking and Beatrice's laughter. The ticking of the wall clock echoed in the empty hallway, sounding like a slow leak in the foundation of my life. I had returned from the wedding, feeling like a man who had been surgically removed from his own lineage. I soon discovered, through a mutual friend, that Beatrice and Julian had held a lavish housewarming party for a new penthouse 6 months ago. I was the only immediate family member not told about the move. The realization stung more than any circuit burn I'd ever endured. Between 2022 and 2024, the phone calls from my daughter transformed from weekly check-ins to monthly obligations, and then finally to sporadic hollow texts. I found myself trapped in an agonizing ritual, staring at the cold blue light of the smartphone screen in my dark kitchen. I would send a simple message like, "Hey B, just checking in. Saw it's supposed to rain by you. Love, Dad." I would watch the notification change to red, but the reply, if it came at all, was a clipped, "Busy, Dad. Talk soon." I knew Julian was the architect of this digital wall, but Beatrice was the one holding the door shut. My daughter's love had become a flickering bulb in a distant room. I knew it was there, but it no longer provided enough light to see by. The air in the house grew stale, smelling of old wood and the industrial soap I used to scrub the day's labor off my skin. I worked my shifts at the substation, with a mechanical precision, but the pride I once felt in keeping the city's heart beating was being replaced by a gnawing isolation. Thanksgiving 2024 arrived, and for the first time there was no invitation, not even a polite excuse about traveling to the Sinclair's second home. Out of a stubborn, lonely habit, I bought a single turkey breast. The smell of it roasting in the large oven felt like an indictment of my solitude. I set a place for Margaret's photo, the silver frame catching the dim November light, and stared at the empty chair where Beatrice used to sit. Have you ever cooked a holiday meal just to prove to the walls that you're still alive? It's a performance for an audience of ghosts. I pulled up my phone and saw the Sinclair family's social media posts. They were gathered in Lake Forest, around a catered table that looked like it belonged in a museum, laughing with people whose names I couldn't pronounce. I had been completely edited out of the narrative, a rough draft that was no longer fit for publication. Happy Thanksgiving, Margaret, I whispered to the empty room. She's just busy with work this year. The lie tasted like ash. A week later, a thick, expensive envelope arrived in the mail. I felt the textured, high-grade cardstock, the kind Julian favored. It was a generic, pre-printed Christmas card from the Sinclairs. There was no personal note, just a professional family portrait. My breath hitched when I saw the signatures at the bottom. It was the first time I saw it in writing Beatrice Sinclair. She had legally dropped Thorne from her name entirely. I stared at that glossy card, at her name printed in elegant gold foil, and realized that my daughter hadn't just moved to the Gold Coast. She had erased the man who built the map to get her there. Cedar shavings are the only thing that smells like hope anymore. So I spent 60 nights in the basement, hands vibrating from the sander, carving a world where my granddaughter might finally know my name. In the quiet of my Bridgeport workshop, the high-pitched whine of the detail sander was the only sound that could drown out the silence of the Thanksgiving I'd spent alone. I'd seen the glossy card, the gold foil, and the erasure of my name, but I refused to be a ghost to Clara. I discovered that Julian had already purchased a $2,000 plastic designer-branded dollhouse for her birthday, a hollow thing made in a factory, chosen simply because of the luxury logo on the box. It didn't matter. I was building a legacy in miniature. I painstakingly crafted a Victorian-style house, pouring my longing into hand-carved window frames and tiny copper circuits. I used my master electrician's hands to install intricate electrical wiring, allowing every tiny room to glow with a warm, golden light from grain of wheat bulbs. I could almost see her face, my granddaughter, with Margaret's eyes as she flipped the tiny master switch I'd hidden under the porch. Just like the real thing, Margaret, I whispered, my rough calluses tracing the smooth, painted miniature banister. She's going to love the way the porch light flickers. A dollhouse needs a solid foundation. Apparently a family doesn't. Not if you have enough money to buy a new one every season. By June 2025, the sharp, comforting scent of fresh cedar and linseed oil had permeated my skin, a badge of paternal devotion. I finally picked up the phone in the kitchen to arrange the delivery for Clara's 4th birthday. Beatrice's voice was cold and efficient, the sound of a woman reading from a curated script. "Dad, we've already hired a professional event planner in Lake Forest," she said, her tone as sterile as a hospital ward. "The party has a Nordic minimalist theme. We have a photographer coming from New York to capture the visual narrative." Curated Beatrice. I said, my voice cracking, "It's a dollhouse. I wired it myself. I spent months on the joinery. It's for my granddaughter." She sighed, and the sudden ringing silence that followed was a physical blow. "It's just too Bridgeport, Dad. It doesn't fit the aesthetic. Please don't make this difficult. We can't have bulky handmade wooden toys in the background of the professional shots. It would be confusing for Julian's business associates to see you there looking, well, like you do." When did my daughter start seeing her own father as a smudge on a high-resolution photograph? The betrayal went deeper than a rejected gift. As the silence stretched between us, Beatrice revealed that she had told Clara I lived far away in another country. She was killing me off in the child's mind to keep her social ledger clean. I was an inconvenient ghost, a piece of industrial grit she was desperate to sweep under the rug of her new life. I stood in the dark basement after she hung up the tiny lights of the dollhouse, glowing like a mockery of a home I no longer had. The sharp smell of the cedar now felt like a funeral wreath. "Just mail it, Dad." Her final words echoed in the empty room. "We'll put it in the attic for later." I reached out and touched the miniature roof, my hands shaking, knowing that later would never come. The sound of heavy packing tape screaming against a cardboard box felt like I was sealing up my own heart for long-term storage. I stood in the dim light of my basement workshop, the tiny warm glow of the dollhouse rooms extinguished one by one as I prepared to hide my work from the world. As I tucked the final layer of bubble wrap around the hand-carved gables, I felt a sharp, rectangular bump in the wood. It was an old photograph of Margaret holding Beatrice as a baby, her eyes bright with the kind of hope that only new mothers and master builders truly understand. I'd hidden it inside the secret attic space of the dollhouse months ago, a quiet anchor for Clara to find one day. Now it was a message in a bottle, heading into a sea of Nordic minimalism that wanted to forget I ever existed. I secured the flaps of the box, the dry, dusty scent of cardboard and adhesive stinging my nose. I carried the heavy weight out to my truck, my joints complaining as I moved my rejected love toward the Bridgeport post office. The lobby was a symphony of fluorescent hums and the sharp smell of printer ink. I hoisted the box onto the industrial scale, the metal groaning under the weight of 60 nights of labor. "Fragile," the clerk asked, her hand hovering over a roll of bright yellow warning stickers. "More than you know," I replied. I watched her slap the label onto the side, a tracking number becoming the only tether I had left to my granddaughter. How much does a grandfather weigh when he's been reduced to a tracking number and a cardboard box? It felt like I was shipping my soul to a destination that didn't have a loading dock for men like me. I paid the shipping fee, staring at the clinical yellow of the receipt, as if it were a legal decree of my exile. I drove back to the house, the silence in the driveway echoing the hollow space in the basement. I spent the next few days in a state of suspended animation, my phone never more than a few inches from my hand. I imagined Clara discovering the lights, flipping the tiny master switch, or perhaps stumbling upon the photo of the grandmother she would never meet. I waited for a grainy video, a phone call, or even a brief warm sentence from Beatrice acknowledging that her father had poured his life into a gift. Instead, the only sound in the kitchen was the ticking of the wall clock mocking my wait. Finally, the notification came. Delivered, signed for, discarded. 3 stages of a modern family's death. I stared at the cold, smooth glass of my smartphone screen as a text message appeared from Beatrice. "Package received. Thanks." The words were so devoid of life, so mechanically polite, that I felt the temperature in the room drop. I tapped on the contact details, and a familiar bitter chill ran down my spine. The message hadn't even been typed by Beatrice. It carried the small digital signature of her professional assistant's automated reply system. My daughter hadn't even found 3 seconds to acknowledge the world I'd built for her child. I stared at the delivered status on my screen, wondering when love became a logistical transaction, signed, sealed, and filed away without a second thought. A knock at my door at 10 at night usually means a neighbor's circuit breaker has popped. But the woman standing in the rain wasn't a neighbor. It was the daughter who hadn't called me in months. I had spent the last hour staring at the bank's website, the chime of the login screen still echoing in my ears as I watched the numbers of my retirement account glow like a dying ember. Seeing Beatrice on my porch, her designer coat soaked through and her eyes wide with a frantic, wet desperation, I felt my wariness dissolve into a father's instinctive panic. She didn't come to Bridgeport because she missed me. She came because Julian's high society parents had finally seen through his disruption jargon and refused to lend him another dime. I was the lender of last resort. Beatrice entered the kitchen, the smell of wet wool and expensive perfume filling the small space. She looked smaller, shivering under the flickering fluorescent light that cast long, tired shadows across my old checkbook. She began to speak of Julian's brilliant tech breakthrough, a pre-IPO opportunity that was just one investment away from changing their lives forever. She avoided looking at Margaret's photo on the mantel, yet her plea was wrapped in the language of family security and ancestral pride. "Dad, Julian is so close," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This is about our future. It could mean we never have to worry again." "I'm 60, B," I said, my voice heavy with the weight of 30 years spent on rickety ladders and in damp substations. "That retirement fund is all I have left of my life's work. It's my sunset honey." I felt like a transformer blowing in the middle of a storm, bright hot, and knowing that once I spent this energy, I'd be nothing but cold iron. But Beatrice broke down, then, her tears genuine enough to bypass my common sense. She claimed Julian's partners were pressuring him, that their entire Gold Coast life was at risk of a catastrophic shutdown. I saw the daughter who used to hide behind my legs when the thunder got too loud, haunted by my promise to Margaret to shield our girl from the cold. I convinced myself that this was my final chance to be the hero she needed. Would you do it? Would you hand over the only safety net you had to a person who only remembers you exist when the bill comes due? My hand shook as the pen met the paper, the rain drumming a frantic rhythm against the window pane like a warning I chose to ignore. I signed over $50,000, every cent I had saved, for the years when my knees would finally give out. "You'll have it back by Christmas, Dad," she promised, clutching the check. "With interest." "Don't worry about the interest, B," I said, feeling a hollow lightness in my chest. "Just come visit more often." As she hurried toward the door, she accidentally left her phone on the kitchen table for a split second, while reaching for her umbrella. A notification lit up the screen, and I couldn't help but look. It was a text from Julian. "Did the old man bite need the funds for the club membership fee by Monday?" The ink on my signature was still wet when the notification on her screen told me I hadn't just invested in a daughter's future, I'd paid for a son-in-law's ego. The sound of the front door closing as Beatrice left with my life's savings felt like a vault locking me inside my own poverty. There is a specific kind of cold that settles in your bones when you realize the person you die for is busy spending your life's work on things that sparkle and fade. I sat at my kitchen table, the air thick with the stale metallic scent of a house where I had to keep the thermostat low just to make the remaining numbers in my checking account stretch. Before me lay a mounting stack of mail, the red overdue stamps on the envelope windows glaring at me like small, angry eyes. I checked my phone, hoping for a message from Beatrice saying she had changed her mind, but instead, the high-pitched artificial chime of a social media notification broke the silence. The algorithm pushed a suggested post into my feed that made my stomach drop. There was Julian Sinclair grinning like a shark next to a sleek, metallic blue Porsche Taycan. The caption read, "Success is a choice," but my eyes went straight to the background. They were parked in front of an exclusive private club in Lake Forest, an establishment whose initiation fee was exactly $50,000. The investment, Beatrice had sworn, was for Julian's tech firm. $50,000, I whispered to the empty room, my voice cracking. "That is 200 months of rent, Margaret. Gone in one car payment and a velvet rope. A master electrician knows when a circuit is overloaded." I was watching my own life spark and smoke, and my daughter was the one holding the wire. My fingers trembled as I hit her contact name. The phone felt hot against my ear as I listened to the ringing, my heart hammering against my ribs. When she finally answered, her voice was already sharp, guarded by a defensive wall I didn't know how to climb. "Dad, I'm in the middle of a meeting," she said, though. I could hear the wind whistling past the car window. "Beatrice, I saw the car," I said, trying to keep my voice from breaking. "I'm looking at a final notice from the landlord. I just need a fraction of it back. $2,000 to keep the lights on and my tools out of the pawn shop." Her response was a masterclass in gaslighting. She accused me of monitoring her life like a common stalker and claimed the Porsche was a business necessity to maintain Julian's image for the investors. "Dad, stop being so small-minded," she hissed. "Julian is playing at a level you don't understand. We will pay you back when the IPO happens. If you really loved me, you wouldn't hold a family loan over my head like a debt collector." When does a loan between family become a ransom payment for a love that was never really there? I realized then that my sacrifice hadn't bought her security. It had bought her silence. She informed me that Julian had convinced her to put me on limited contact. Apparently, my financial nagging was affecting Julian's mental focus for their upcoming project launch. She hung up on me the dial tone, a flat digital line that matched the pulse of my bank account, leaving me with one final truth: I was no longer a father to her. I was just a spent battery. I stared at the dark screen, the only sound left in the kitchen being the drip of a leaky faucet I could no longer afford to fix. The invitation was thick, cream-colored cardstock that felt far too heavy for a bridge that had already been burned to the waterline. I stood in my kitchen, the dial tone from my last argument with Beatrice still humming in the back of my mind. It had been 2 months of silence. 2 months of watching my bank account bleed out while Julian's social media feed glowed with the blue neon of his new Porsche. I had reached the point where I was no longer a father to her, just a spent battery discarded in the dark. But then the courier arrived. He didn't come from the post office. He wore a crisp uniform and drove a vehicle that looked too expensive for my Bridgeport street. I realized the invitation wasn't mailed because Beatrice didn't want me to have her current return address, a final security measure against the man who had raised her. I tore open the heavy paper envelope, the sound echoing through the quiet house like a sharp intake of breath. Inside was a VIP pass to the grand opening of the Apex, the billion-dollar smart building Julian had been hyping for years. A handwritten note fell out the ink, smelling faint and sterile. "It's time to move past the misunderstandings, Dad," I read aloud, searching for the daughter I used to know behind the professional, curated handwriting. "Julian really wants you there to share in our success." I read and reread those words, my calloused fingers tracing the cool, smooth weight of the cardstock. "Hope is a dangerous fuse. You keep lighting it, expecting a warm hearth, only to find yourself holding the dynamite when the clock runs out." I looked at the pile of final notice bills on the counter, then back at the gold-embossed logo of the Apex catching the dim kitchen light. Maybe Julian's success finally meant a return to the family table, or at least the $50,000 that would save my home. Why does a father's heart always have a back door left unlocked for the child who keeps stealing the silver? I decided right then to take the gamble. I spent my last few dollars on a proper haircut and dry cleaning for my best white shirt, viewing this gala as the clutch moment where I could finally prove my worth to the Sinclair world. I turned to Margaret's photo, the silver frame the only bright thing left in the room. "One more job, Margaret," I promised her. "One more night to show them I'm the anchor of this family, not the anchor dragging them down. I will make things right before Christmas." I felt a surge of determined vulnerability, a belief that if I just looked the part, they would see the man underneath again. However, as I turned the card over, I found a small postscript on the back that acted as a sudden cold front. "Formal attire is non-negotiable." The note specified a subtle warning that my presence was strictly conditional on my appearance. It wasn't an invitation to a home. It was a summons to a performance where the dress code was a leash. I tucked the invitation into the pocket of my shirt, not knowing that the moving past misunderstandings was just the first step into a trap I never saw coming. The bridge wasn't being rebuilt. I was just being lured across it, so they could watch the final collapse from the safety of the 85th floor. The morning of December 5th started with a sky the color of a bruised circuit board, but inside my small Bridgeport kitchen, I was busy trying to wire my own heart for hope. I reached for the dusty navy blue box on the top shelf of my closet. Inside sat the silk tie Margaret had bought me for our 30th anniversary. As I opened the lid, a small yellowed slip of paper fluttered out, a note from her that I must have missed a dozen times over the years. "I am so proud of your working hands, Elias," it read in her familiar flowing script. My breath hitched. Those hands were currently shaking as I reached for the tie, but seeing her words today of all days felt like a surge of power to a failing motor. I had tucked the invitation into the pocket of my best white shirt, and for a moment, the trap I felt walking into didn't seem quite so certain. By 9, I was sitting in Tony's barbershop, a relic of the old neighborhood, where the smell of bay rum, aftershave, and talcum powder acted as a balm for my frayed nerves. Tony, a man who had seen my hair turn from coal black to a tired iron gray, hummed a tuneless melody as the clippers vibrated against my neck. "Going somewhere important, Elias?" he asked, tilting my head with a firm, practiced hand. "You haven't asked for a straight razor shave since the wedding." I watched my reflection in the mirror as the sharp, clean line of a fresh haircut began to emerge. "My daughter's big night, Tony," I said, trying to find the man Margaret once loved beneath the weary ghost I had become. "I need to look like I belong there." Tony offered a rare, knowing nod of encouragement, and for the first time in 3 years, I didn't look away from my own eyes. A master electrician knows that one loose connection can burn down a whole house. I was making sure my shoes were shined and my tie was straight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the wiring was already smoking. Back at the house, the rhythmic hiss of the steam iron against my cotton shirt filled the silence of the empty rooms. I moved with the meticulous precision I used to map a high-voltage transformer, smoothing out every crease until the fabric was as crisp as the invitation itself. The hot starch filled the air, a nostalgic scent that reminded me of Sunday mornings long ago. As I began the careful ritual of knotting the navy silk, I spoke to Margaret's photograph on the dresser. "Look at me, Margaret, cleaned up and ready to be a father again." I stood tall, ignoring the dull ache of arthritis in my knees, and adjusted the deep navy silk between my calloused fingers. How many times can a man polish his pride before it starts to wear thin? It felt like I was arming myself for a battle I wasn't allowed to win, but the resolve in my chest was as steady as a grounded wire. I checked the gas gauge on my old truck and realized with a jolt that I didn't have enough to make it to Lake Forest and back. I had to stop at the station watching the numbers on the pump climb as I spent my last few emergency dollars. It left me with literally zero cash, a total gamble on a night that promised reconciliation but offered no guarantees. I turned off the kitchen light and locked the door, the invitation tucked against my chest, like a shield, unaware that the storm on the horizon was the least of my worries. The snow began to fall in earnest by the time I hit Lakeshore Drive, the flakes swirling like static in the beam of my headlights. I drove toward the gleaming tower of the apex, a monument of glass and arrogance that seemed to pierce the very storm I was battling. I felt the weight of Margaret's note in my pocket, a quiet anchor of dignity, as I steered my old truck into the cavernous entrance of the parking garage. The rhythmic, desperate thud of a hand against glass echoed through the concrete silence of parking level P3, a sound that stopped me cold before I could even turn off my engine. I looked up, noticing that the building's security cameras in this sector were all angled away from the far corner, a blind spot that felt intentional in a place this smart. I climbed out of the truck, the smell of damp concrete and cold exhaust heavy in the air. A few yards away, a high-end Tesla Model X sat under the flickering, cold, fluorescent lights, its falcon doors half-cocked and frozen like the broken wings of a prehistoric bird. Leonora Vance, the 78-year-old titan of Vance Holdings, was currently a panicked silhouette behind the tempered glass, her silver hair disheveled and her sharp blue eyes wide with the terror of a trapped animal. I recognized her immediately from the trade journals. She was the woman who owned half the skyline, yet here she was clawing at the window of a vacuum-sealed tomb. "Can you hear me?" The glass muffled her scream. "The manual release isn't working, ma'am. Stay calm," I shouted, pressing my palms against the cold, matte black finish. "Take slow breaths. I'm an electrician. I'm going to get you out." I could feel the vibration of the car's dead internal fans struggling to spin a futile mechanical heartbeat. $1 billion building, $100,000 car, and here she was, dying for lack of a 50-cent mechanical lever. I checked the external sensors and the charging port, but they were dead to the touch, and the acrid ozone scent of a fried circuit board began to seep from the undercarriage. It was a technical irony I didn't have time to appreciate. The smart building's localized grid was likely inducing a firmware loop in the car's security system. The woman's breath was fogging the reinforced glass, her movements becoming more frantic. "It's getting tight. I can't breathe," she gasped, her eyes searching mine with a primal terror. "Look at me." I commanded, my voice the same one I used to calm apprentices during high-voltage surges. "Don't look at the walls, look at me. I'm not leaving until that door is open." Ever seen the light go out in someone's eyes when they realize a computer is deciding whether they live or die? Her dignified bearing was dissolving into raw survival instinct as she began to hyperventilate. In a stuttering voice, she revealed that she was supposed to be the guest of honor upstairs, and that she was intentionally late to test the building's readiness. She claimed Julian would use her absence to consolidate power, assuming she had simply snubbed him. I looked at my clean, ironed white sleeves, and then at the oily black hydraulic fluid leaking from the car's undercarriage. I had 10 minutes to be a guest, or 1 minute to be a savior. The electronic locks remained completely unresponsive, and the woman inside was spiraling into a full-blown panic attack, her silver head thumping rhythmically against the glass. I didn't think about the dry cleaning bill or the carefully knotted silk of Margaret's tie as I dropped to my knees in the black, shimmering puddle of hydraulic fluid. I only thought about the air running out behind that glass. The pristine white cotton of my shirt was the first thing to go soaking up the cold, oily slick of the garage floor, like a sponge. I crawled beneath the Tesla's matte chassis, my suit jacket grinding into the concrete grit. My fingers, practiced in the dark of 1,000 crawl spaces, felt for the emergency mechanical release cable. It was jammed tight, locked by a localized electrical surge that shouldn't have been possible. Then I saw it, a rogue signal jammer, hidden deep in the car's wheel, well blinking a faint, malicious red. This wasn't a malfunction. It was an ambush. Someone wanted this woman silenced in the shadows of level P3. I didn't have time to ponder the cruelty of it. Just a little more, I grunted, my muscles straining against the unyielding metal. "Come on, you stubborn circuit." I gave the manual override a final desperate tug. A spray of hot hydraulic fluid hissed out, coating my face and chest in a stinging, greasy film. I didn't flinch. There was a heavy metallic thwack of the Falcon doors finally disengaging, a sound like a physical weight being lifted from the air. Click, hiss, the door groaned open. A life was saved, but a shirt was murdered. Leonora Vance collapsed out of the car, gasping for the cold, stale garage air as if it were the purest mountain oxygen. Her silver hair was a wild halo around her pale face. I dragged myself out from under the car, looking like I'd just survived a boiler explosion. I helped her to a nearby concrete pillar, the black, oily smear across my front, a badge of a battle she barely understood. She leaned against the pillar, her sharp blue eyes focusing on me with a profound, trembling intensity. I can't thank you enough," she wheezed. "You don't know who." "I have to go, ma'am." I interrupted, checking my watch with a jolt of panic. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "My daughter. She's waiting on the 85th floor. I'm already late. Just take it slow." She reached into her clutch and pressed a heavy, velvet-textured business card into my greasy palm. I didn't look at it. I only thought about the minutes ticking away. I was running for the elevator like a man trying to outrace a short circuit. I hit the call button with a stained finger, the overpowering scent of warm hydraulic fluid and garage dust following me like a shroud. I was a mess of oil and starch, the slick, greasy texture of the fluid soaking through my undershirt to my skin. As the elevator doors began to close, I finally glanced at the card. It bore no name, only a gold-embossed phoenix and a private direct line. I caught my reflection in the mirrored steel of the elevator doors, and my heart sank. I didn't look like a VIP guest. I looked like the very working-class ghost Julian had warned me not to be. The transition from savior to social pariah was happening in the time it took for a motor to hum. I was 20 minutes late, covered in filth, and about to walk into the lion's den with nothing but a ruined tie and a stranger's card. The elevator chime was the sound of a guillotine blade dropping, and as the brushed steel doors slid open, the 85th floor of the Apex greeted me with a wall of judgmental silence and the scent of $500 an ounce perfume. I caught my reflection in the mirrored steel of the doors just before they fully parted, and my heart sank. I didn't look like a VIP guest. I looked like the very working-class ghost Julian had warned me not to be. I stepped into the panoramic lobby, my grease-smeared face and oil-blackened shirt clashing violently with the sterile, minimalist luxury of the smart building. The blindingly white, polished marble floor seemed to catch and amplify the black oil on my shoes with every heavy step I took. Guests in impeccably tailored tuxedos and shimmering evening gowns recoiled as I passed, their conversations dying out mid-sentence. I could hear the sharp whispers behind me cutting through the clinking of crystal glasses like jagged glass. "Is that man supposed to be here?" someone murmured. "Someone call security before he touches anything." I frantically scanned the room for Beatrice, my hands trembling as I tried to wipe the stubborn hydraulic fluid from my palms onto a cocktail napkin I'd snatched from a passing server, only to watch the black smear spread further across my skin. I tried to maintain some shred of the dignity I'd felt after rescuing the woman in the garage, but under the glare of 1,000 recessed LED lights, I was just a stain on their perfect evening. "I'm with the Thorn. I'm the father of the host," I managed to stammer as a security guard began to move toward me. The betrayal felt even sharper when I realized Beatrice had already told the event staff that her father couldn't make it due to illness, making my disheveled appearance look like a desperate lie she'd now have to cover up. 85 floors up. I should have felt like I was on top of the world. Instead, I felt like a cockroach under a spotlight. Beatrice spotted me from across the room, and her face drained of all color, shifting from professional grace to pure, unadulterated horror in the span of a heartbeat. She rushed over her sharp, aggressive heels, clicking a frantic rhythm on the hard floor. She didn't check on my well-being or ask why I was covered in grime. Instead, she grabbed my arm with a grip, like a vice, her manicured nails digging into my forearm through the thin fabric of my ruined shirt. "Dad, what have you done?" She hissed, her voice a sharp, frantic whisper, as she physically blocked me from the view of a nearby group of venture capitalists. "You look like you've crawled out of a sewer bee." There was an accident in the garage. I tried to explain, my heart breaking with every word. "I helped a woman. She was trapped." "I don't care about the garage." She snapped, her eyes darting toward Julian. "You're ruining everything. Go to the mechanical room, now." Have you ever seen your own child look at you and see nothing but a mistake that needs to be erased? I realized she was more afraid of Julian's reaction than she was concerned for my safety or dignity. I let her push me toward the shadows until the service door swung open, and I found myself face to face with Julian and the very board of directors I was supposed to impress. Julian didn't just look at me, he audited me, his eyes sweeping over my oil-stained sleeves with the clinical coldness of a man calculating the exact impact of my presence on his company's stock price. I had just been shoved through the service door by my own daughter, only to find myself in the center of a semicircle of power. James Sterling, the formidable CEO of Sterling Tech, stood with a champagne glass frozen halfway to his lips, his gray eyebrows knitting together in a look of corporate disapproval. Next to him, Robert Sterling, the firm's CFO, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his eyes darting between Julian and me as if he were auditing a balance sheet in real time. Beatrice darling, is this the retired consultant you mentioned? Julian asked, his voice booming for the benefit of the board. He looks more like a janitor who lost his way in the vents. Beatrice stood frozen, the silk of her dress shimmering under the recessed LED lights, as she searched for a lie that wouldn't catch in her throat. Julian, he's my father, she began, but Julian cut her off with a sharp, dismissive wave. He's a liability, Beatrice. Look at the grease on his hands. It's primitive. He then leaned in, his eyes gleaming with a new, cruel inspiration. He told the board that I was actually a human interest prop, a before picture, for the firm's new Southside charity initiative. I was the only fuse left in a room full of high-voltage lies, and Julian was currently trying to stomp me out before I could light the fuse. Meredith Sinclair joined the circle, her diamond rings catching the light as she clutched her pearls. "Does he need a handout, Julian?" she asked with a terrifyingly sweet tilt of her head. "I have some change in my clutch if he's hungry." The heat radiating from Julian as he stepped aggressively into my personal space was stifling, smelling of expensive gin and a sharp, panic-induced musk. "Handout," I said, my voice finally finding its ground. "Julian, you're wearing my retirement on your wrist and driving it in your garage." Julian scoffed, telling the board I didn't understand the velocity of capital. Before I reveal the truth behind that $50,000 investment, comment 1. If you think Julian deserves to lose everything, or 2, if you think Beatrice is the real villain here, and add one short reason why. Please note the next part includes recreated details for narrative purposes to convey the lesson of integrity. If you're still with me, listen closely. 50,000, my house, my wife's peace, Julian's watch. The math didn't add up, but the truth finally did. "Tell them, Julian," I shouted, the silence in the room turning heavy and absolute. "Tell them about the $50,000 of mine you invested in a leather interior." James Sterling stepped forward, his eyes sharp with suspicion as he looked at Julian's sweating forehead. Beatrice finally moved, but only to grab my arm. "Dad, stop," she cried, her voice desperate. It was a gift. He gave it to us freely. She was trying to legally erase the debt right there, sacrificing my survival to save a tuxedo. Julian's face turned the color of raw liver as the CEO of Sterling Tech stepped forward to demand an explanation for the family loan. But before he could speak, every light in the building went out. The darkness didn't just fall. It slammed into the room like a physical weight, snuffing out the diamond glints and the judging eyes in a single terrifying heartbeat. One moment Julian was looming over me, his face a mask of sweating rage. The next, he was just a disembodied voice screaming into a void that smelled of ozone and overheated copper wire. The sudden silence of the primary power grid was deafening, replaced only by the high-pitched dying whine of the building's massive cooling fans. Panic ripped through the elite crowd as the smart building's life support systems staggered. Julian, blinded and cornered, launched into a vicious, unhinged defense. He didn't know his lapel mic was still live on the emergency channel. "You did this, didn't you?" he shrieked, his voice cracking like a dry circuit. "You pulled a wire to make me look bad. You manual trash. I skipped the final stress test to get this launch under budget. And you found the one weak link," Beatrice sob-whispered for him to be quiet. Her voice a ragged thread in the dark. "Julian, stop. Everyone can still hear you," but he was too far gone, character disintegrating as fast as the system he'd built on lies. Total system failure. In a world of digital ghosts, the only thing real was the smell of ozone and the sound of Julian's career burning to the ground. Emergency LEDs finally flickered on, casting an eerie spectral red glow over the panicked faces of the board members. I stood perfectly still, my electrician's ears cataloging the specific clicks of the secondary generators failing to catch. James Sterling stood nearby, his face an ashen gray in the emergency light. "The redundant servers are down." He barked toward the tech team, who were frantically tapping on dead tablets. This shouldn't be possible. I looked at the dark panels and felt the vibration of the cold floor beneath my boots. It's a firmware-hardware mismatch, I said, my voice steady in the chaos. You overshot the capacity for the backup relays by 30%. You're trying to run a smart building on a dumb foundation. Why is it that when the power goes out, the people who claim to run the world are always the first to start screaming like children? Julian scrambled toward me, his expensive tuxedo jacket torn, looking for a scapegoat, even as the CEO watched him with growing disgust. I reached into my pocket and touched the business card the woman in the garage had given me. Suddenly, I noticed a familiar flicker on the building's diagnostic hub, the same rhythmic pulse I'd seen in the Tesla's wheel well. The blackout hadn't been an accident. It was a deliberate surge, triggered by the same signal jammer I'd found in P3. This wasn't just a glitch. It was an arrival. The building was waiting for a master key that Julian didn't even know existed. I looked at Beatrice, who was huddling near a broken crystal sculpture, her polished facade completely shattered. The high-end perfume in the air was being choked out by the sharp, acrid scent of frying electrical components. The emergency elevator doors suddenly groaned open with a hiss of backup hydraulics, a sound that cut through the shouting like a thunderclap. A silhouette stepped into the red light that made everyone, including Julian, stop breathing. The figure stood tall, radiating a cold, focused authority that didn't need a single LED to be felt. The silence that followed was more absolute than the darkness had been. The woman who stepped out of the shadows didn't look like someone who had just been trapped in a steel tomb. She looked like the storm itself, dressed in charcoal wool and carrying a silence that was louder than Julian's screaming. Leonora Vance stepped into the red emergency light of the lounge, the heavy metallic thud of the elevator door closing behind her like a period at the end of Julian's unhinged sentence. The silver in her hair caught the strobe of the emergency lights, making her look like a spectral queen presiding over a wreckage. I recognized her instantly, the cold, crisp scent of outdoor snow still clinging to her coat. But to the board of directors, she was a shock. Leonora, I realized, had bypassed the security override herself, using a physical key Julian didn't even know existed, proving she owned the building's skeleton, not just its skin. Julian scrambled to find his footing, his voice cracking like a dry circuit. Mrs. Vance, the weather report suggested your arrival would be delayed. He stammered, his face a ghostly white in the red glow. The weather didn't stop me, Julian. She replied, her voice low and dangerous. Neither did the technical incompetence of your security grid. Julian tried to frame the blackout as a minor calibration issue, but Leonora wasn't listening. Power isn't about the lights coming on. It's about being the person everyone looks at when they're terrified of the dark. Leonora Vance was the sun. James Sterling stepped forward, trying to salvage the firm's reputation by welcoming the matriarch. Leonora, please accept my apologies. This localized outage is being handled by our best engineers. She ignored his outstretched hand, her sharp eyes scanning the room like a thermal sensor. Your best engineers are currently hyperventilating in the server room, James. I'm looking for a master, not a technician. The elite guests, still huddled in the shadows, began to whisper her name, realizing the end boss of Chicago real estate had arrived in the middle of a catastrophe. Why is it that the most powerful people in the room always have the quietest voices? Leonora moved with a focused authority that made the static electricity in the air hum. Julian attempted to step into her path, his posture a mix of corporate deference and desperate damage control. He tried to gesture toward the darkened panoramic windows, as if he still controlled the view. But Leonora didn't look at him. She didn't look at James Sterling or the cowering board members. She walked straight toward me, her heavy work boots sounding a steady, grounded rhythm on the marble floor. I felt the invitation in my pocket, the one that specified formal attire, and I felt the black hydraulic fluid soaking through my ruined shirt. I was a stain on Julian's aesthetic, but Leonora stopped directly in front of me. She reached into her pocket and held out a card, the heavy, velvet-textured business card, with the gold-embossed phoenix that I thought I'd hidden away. "Is this yours?" she asked, her voice cutting through the silence. Every head in the room turned toward us. The board members blinked their eyes, darting between the titan of industry and the grease-smeared ghost. She didn't look at the board of directors, and she didn't look at the shivering man who had just called me a liability. She looked at the grease on my shirt and smiled as if she'd found a diamond in a coal bin. The business card in her hand was a gold-flecked accusation that the room couldn't ignore, its sharp edges catching the red emergency light as she stepped past the billionaires to find the man they had just tried to bury. I felt the weight of the heavy textured card as Leonora Vance pressed it back into my greasy palm, her sharp blue eyes never leaving mine. The faint scent of charcoal and winter air clinging to her coat was a stark contrast to the cloying, panic-scented atmosphere of the lounge. Julian stood mere inches away, his expensive silk tie appearing to choke him as he stammered for a narrative that had already crumbled. I didn't know, Mrs. Vance," he managed to gasp, his face a sickly gray in the red emergency light. He didn't say why he was late. Leonora didn't even look at him. She described the suffocating silence of the parking garage, the vacuum-sealed tomb her vehicle had become, while the air ran thin. She told the room that while the visionaries were upstairs sipping champagne and debating the velocity of capital, it was a man with oil on his sleeves and grit under his nails who dropped to his knees in the dark to save her. Leonora revealed she actually heard Julian's liability speech through the building's emergency comm system while she was still in the elevator. Every cruel word he uttered about manual trash had been recorded by the very system he designed to monitor others. "You called him a liability, Julian," she asked, her voice like a cold chisel. "This man is the only reason I am standing in your building instead of being wheeled out of it. One minute I was a stain on a Persian rug. The next, I was the only person Leonora Vance was willing to speak to." The elite guests and board members reacted with audible gasps, the social floor shifting beneath their feet. Julian tried to pivot, his hands fluttering. "He's my father, Leonora. We were so concerned about his state." Beatrice stood in the corner, her face a mask of shame as she finally met my eyes. But Leonora didn't let the lie breathe. "You weren't concerned about his state, Beatrice," she said, her voice cutting through the sharp, echoing silence that followed. "You were concerned about your aesthetic. You were ashamed of the foundation that built you." Julian was a sinking ship made of glass, beautiful to look at, until the first wave of real consequences hit the hull. I watched him shrink as James Sterling and the other board members retreated from him, as if his failure were contagious. Leonora's presence had turned the 85th floor into a courtroom, and the verdict was already written in the sweat beading on Julian's forehead. She announced to the stunned audience that her foundation's $200 million investment was contingent on sterling character, a quality she now found entirely absent in Julian Sinclair. The $50,000 revelation I had made moments ago wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was the final nail in a corporate coffin. She turned her back on the board of directors, as if they were nothing more than furniture, and looked me straight in the eye. Her next words cold enough to freeze the champagne in Julian's hand. I stood there dazed, but finally feeling the warmth of justice holding a card that felt less like a business contact and more like a master key to a world that could no longer shut me out. The temperature in the room didn't just drop because the HVAC was down. It dropped because Leonora Vance was finished being polite, and her gaze was a cold scalpel ready to strip the Sinclair name of its stolen prestige. I stood perfectly still, the black grease on my shirt, feeling like a badge of honor under the flickering, emergency red light of the lounge. Leonora turned her focus to Meredith and Julian, her voice carrying across the silent room with the weight of 50 years of authority. She revealed then that she had been a silent benefactor of my union for over a decade, familiar with the intricate blueprints I'd signed and the grids I'd stabilized long before our path crossed in that parking garage. Julian's attempt to frame me as unskilled wasn't just an insult. It was a lie she already held the evidence to disprove. "I have spent half a century building this city, Meredith," she said, her voice cutting through the icy chill of the room. "We built it on the backs of men like Elias Thorne, not on the vanity of people who mistake a trust fund for a personality. You saw a liability on his shirt. I saw a master who didn't hesitate to ruin his best suit to save a stranger while you were upstairs sipping champagne. I watched the elite crowd, sensing the violent change in the social wind, physically distance themselves from the Sinclairs. A social execution. That's what I was watching. In the red light of the emergency flares, the Sinclair dynasty was bleeding out, and no amount of champagne could stop it." Leonora then pivoted toward my daughter. Beatrice was trembling in the shadows, her face a pale mask of horror. "How could you let these parasites convince you that the man who raised you was something to be hidden?" Leonora asked. She didn't raise her voice, but the sharpness of it made the air feel thinner. "Do you think your mother would be proud of the woman who shoves her father into the darkness to protect a silver dress?" Beatrice let out a sharp, dry sob, the mascara streaking down her cheeks in dark, jagged lines. "Leonora, please," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to." "You meant exactly what you did," Beatrice, Leonora countered, stepping closer. "Silence is a choice. You tried to curate a life out of lies, and now look at the foundation. It's as dark as this room. Which is heavier, $50,000 in stolen cash, or the weight of a daughter's head as she realizes she sold her father for a lie?" There was no comfort offered, only the cold mirror of her own betrayal. The smell of cold ash and stale perfume hung in the air like a shroud, just as the silence became unbearable. Meredith Sinclair stepped forward, her face twisted in a new, desperate calculation. She didn't reach for her son. She turned on him. This was Julian's doing. "Leonora," she claimed, her voice high and frantic. "He's the one who insisted on these arrangements. I was only trying to maintain the family image." I watched Julian's face collapse as his own mother sacrificed him to stay in Leonora's good graces, exposing the final ugly truth of the Sinclair loyalty. Leonora turned away from the sobbing Beatrice and looked at the CEO of Sterling Tech with an expression that promised a total corporate eclipse. "We need to discuss your choice of partners, James." The silence that followed Leonora's words wasn't just quiet. It was the sound of a billion-dollar career shattering into jagged pieces of glass on the 85th floor marble. I stood in the eerie, spectral red glow of the emergency lights, watching the sweat glisten on James Sterling's upper lip as the full weight of Leonora's gaze pinned him to the floor. Leonora didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She addressed James with an ice-cold precision that made the high society whispers in the room vanish instantly. She stated that Vance Holdings would no longer associate with any firm that employed character-bankrupt parasites like Julian Sinclair. Julian tried to interject, his hands fluttering, as he claimed the $50,000 was legally spent as an investment. Leonora didn't even turn her head. She revealed that her legal team had already drafted a fraud complaint while she was waiting for the elevator in P3 documented and ready for filing. "You have 72 hours to return every cent to Mr. Thorne, Julian," she said, her voice a sharp blade in the dark. "If it's a second late, I'll spend 10 times that amount, ensuring you never work in this hemisphere again." James Sterling didn't hesitate. He knew his company's survival depended on Leonora's $200 million investment. "Consider it done, Leonora," he said, his voice trembling. "Julian is no longer part of this firm, effective immediately. 72 hours. That was the lifespan of Julian's luxury lifestyle. I could almost hear the Porsche being repossessed in the distance, a hollow echo in a room that had just seen a man's future deleted in seconds. I watched Julian's face collapse, his arrogance replaced by the raw, shivering fear of a man who realized he had finally overloaded his own circuit. The low, rhythmic beep of a battery backup alarm began to pulse somewhere down the hall, and the floor vibrated beneath my boots as the building's internal systems continued to struggle. The bitter smell of burnt silicon grew stronger, a warning that the smart building was failing its final test. Leonora turned back to the room, ignoring the ruined man at her feet. She looked at the wide, pleading eyes of the board members and then directly at me. "Mr. Thorne," she said, and for the first time her voice held a note of genuine professional respect. "These visionaries have left my building in the dark. They've built a cathedral of glass on a foundation of sand. Would you be so kind as to show them how a real master works? Ever notice how fast the elite start looking for a blue-collar savior the second their smart house stops thinking for them?" I looked at my oil-stained hands, and then at the shimmering, redundant server panels that were currently as useless as Julian's cufflinks. "The system is overloaded, Mrs. Vance," I replied, my technical mind already mapping the fault lines. "It needs a manual bypass, not a software update." I realized that by fixing this building, I wasn't just helping Leonora. I was becoming the savior of the very project Julian had used to humiliate me. I looked at the grease on my sleeves and then at the board members who had just called me a ghost. "Show me to the server room," I said, my voice steady and my purpose clear. I was no longer a liability. I was the only person left in the room who knew how to find the light. The server room was a cathedral of blinking lights and humming cooling fans, or at least it should have been. Instead, it was a tomb of silent processors and the smell of scorched silicon that Julian's hand-picked geniuses were too afraid to touch. I pushed past the panicked young IT staff who were frantically rebooting software to no avail, their faces pale in the glow of dead monitors. I ignored the digital interfaces and went straight for the physical relays, the iron skeleton of the building where the real work happens. I discovered a hidden script in the logic controller, a back door Julian had installed to allow him to fake a miraculous recovery later in the night to impress investors. But like everything else he touched, he'd been sloppy, and the system had cascaded out of his control into a catastrophic loop. "Step back, son," I said to a kid in a tailored vest who was stabbing at a keyboard. "You're trying to fix a heart attack with a Band-Aid." He stammered that the dashboard said the protocols were stable, and I just shook my head. "Dashboards don't smell ozone," I told him. "I do." Using my ears, I found the arcing circuit Julian's cost-cutting measures had overloaded. I identified a firmware-hardware mismatch, where the backup controllers were being choked by an artificial loop. Snap. Spark. Silence. The building held its breath while I held the wire. I opened my own toolkit and pulled out a simple copper jumper wire, a physical tool to save a billion-dollar digital empire. With steady hands, I performed a manual override on the primary power bus, hot-wiring the building's backbone to bypass the corrupted AI layer. The heat of the copper jumper wire seeped through my work gloves as I clicked the final relay into place. The deep, rhythmic clack-clack of high-voltage contactors engaging echoed through the room like a giant waking up. A low thrum returned to the floors, the ozone scent fading as the industrial cooling fans roared back to life. "Let there be light," I whispered. "Real light." A sudden blinding return of 4,000 Kelvin LED light flooded the corridor, cascading back through the building from the bottom up. I emerged from the server room, wiping grease from my forehead with a stained sleeve, to find Leonora Vance waiting for me. She didn't look at the board members or the cowering tech team. She looked at me with a look of profound respect. "How does it feel to go from being a liability to the person who owns the keys to the kingdom in less than an hour?" "I don't need a visionary, Elias," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I need a master. I want you as chief technical advisor for Vance Holdings. You'll oversee 47 major properties across North America." "I'm just an electrician from Bridgeport, ma'am," I replied, though my chest tightened with the weight of the moment. "No," she said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You're the man who keeps the world from falling into the dark." The offer included a salary that made Julian's former partnership look like pocket change, and more importantly, the legal authority to audit every project Julian Sinclair ever touched. I accepted her hand not for the money, but for the look on Julian's face when he realized his new boss was the man he'd just tried to throw out with the trash. I was no longer the ghost in the machine. I was the machine's master. I found Beatrice standing at the edge of the observation deck hours later, silhouetted against the Chicago skyline she had sold her soul to join, her reflection in the reinforced glass trembling like a circuit about to blow. The sterile, recycled air of the 85th floor felt colder than the December wind howling against the tempered glass. She turned when she heard my boots, her face streaked with mascara, and something I had not seen in 3 years, genuine shame. "Dad, I do not know how to apologize for what I have done," she whispered, her voice raw. I pulled out my phone, the blue glow casting shadows across both our faces as I opened my call history. "You chose him over me when it mattered most, Beatrice. But it was not just tonight." I turned the screen toward her, watching her eyes widen. 37 attempted calls in the last 3 months alone. 37 times I had reached out to my only child, and 37 times the phone had rung into a void. March 15th, I read aloud. "I called to tell you I had seen Clara's picture on social media. You sent it to voicemail while you were at dinner with Julian's partners." Her hand flew to her mouth. "April 3rd. I asked if I could visit for Clara's birthday. You never called back. Mother's Day." I continued, my voice breaking. "I called because it was the hardest day without your mom. You texted me at 11 p.m. that you had been at a Sinclair brunch." Beatrice sank onto the cold bench, her designer dress pooling around her. "I was so afraid of losing everything I had built. Julian convinced me that staying close to you would make me look weak. Then you did not just lose me, Beatrice. You lost yourself. You lost the woman your mother raised." She looked up at me and did something I had not seen since she was a child. She slid off the bench and knelt on the cold concrete floor, her hands gripping mine with desperation. "I am so sorry, Daddy," she choked out, using the name she had not spoken in 6 months. "I let them convince me you were something to be ashamed of. I chose Julian's approval over your love. I let go of your hand when you needed me most." I pulled her to her feet, my rough hands steadying her shaking frame. I thought of Margaret then, of the promise I had made in that hospital room. "I forgive you, Beatrice, but trust takes time to rebuild. You broke something in me that one night of apologies cannot fix. I need to know you are choosing me this time. Not Julian's approval, not Meredith's acceptance. Me." She nodded, her whole body shaking. "I choose you, Dad. Always. I should have chosen you all along." I pulled her into a hug, then feeling her collapse against my oil-stained shirt, the way she used to when she was small. We stood there on the observation deck, 2 broken people trying to figure out if love could survive betrayal, while the city lights below us flickered like 1,000 second chances waiting to be seized. 1 month later, I stood in the training facility on the 82nd floor of the Apex, watching December sun paint shadows across a room full of young engineers who reminded me why I had stayed in this profession for 40 years. The air smelled of fresh coffee, clean electronics, and possibility. Leonora Vance had spared no expense creating this space, but the centerpiece was a simple wooden workbench I had built in my Bridgeport workshop 30 years ago. "It is not about the newest software," I told the 15 young faces watching me. "It is about understanding the physical reality of electricity. Code can lie. Circuits cannot." I picked up my wire strippers, the rubber grips molded to my hand after decades. A young woman named Sarah Miller raised her hand. "Mr. Thorne, the industry standard now is automated diagnostics. Why would we need manual skills?" I smiled, remembering the terror in Leonora's eyes when her Tesla had become a high-tech coffin. "Because Sarah, when every computer says the system is stable but your ears hear an overloaded transformer and your nose smells ozone, you need to trust your senses more than your screen." I spent the next hour teaching them the manual bypass technique that had saved the Apex. These kids had grown up in a world of apps and interfaces. I was teaching them to read the ancient language of voltage and resistance. By mid-morning, I received a notification that made me pause. My first paycheck from Vance Holdings had cleared a sum so substantial, I had to read it 3 times. But more importantly attached was a separate transaction, $63,000 marked as debt repayment, Sinclair J. Every cent of my retirement fund, plus interest, had been returned in full. During lunch, Sarah approached me with a rolled-up magazine. "Mr. Thorne, I just wanted to say thank you. My father was an electrician, too. He died in an arc flash accident when I was 12. Reading about what you did at the Apex made me realize his skills mattered." She handed me the December issue of Modern Grid and Infrastructure, the cover featuring me in my workshop. The headline read, "Thorne Standard: Why the Future of Smart Cities Depends on Manual Mastery." But it was the sidebar that made my chest tighten. Cautionary tale: the Sinclair collapse. Julian had become a ghost story for business schools, a warning of what happens when ego outpaces expertise. My legacy was being built on competence and integrity. His was being built on caution tape and failure analysis. My phone buzzed with a message from Beatrice's dad, Clara, and I are coming to visit tomorrow. She wants to see your workshop. Is that okay? I typed back with shaking fingers. More than okay, B. I will be waiting. The next morning, I stood in my Bridgeport workshop, the smell of fresh cedar filling the air as I made final adjustments to the dollhouse I had rebuilt from its shattered remains. When I had pulled the broken pieces from the Sinclair's trash, I had wept for an hour. But a master electrician knows that even the most broken circuits can be repaired. I had rebuilt it stronger, reinforcing the joints and upgrading the electrical system. Hidden in the secret attic space, I had placed the photograph of Margaret holding baby Beatrice exactly where it had been before. The sound of tires on gravel made my heart skip. Beatrice's modest Subaru pulled into the driveway. The back door opened and Clara tumbled out, a whirlwind of blonde curls and Margaret's stubborn chin. "Grandpa Elias," she shouted. "Mommy says you build things." I knelt on the cold driveway as Clara ran toward me with fearless trust. She crashed into my arms, and I held her tight, feeling every missed birthday dissolve in the warmth of her small body. "I build lots of things, little bird. Would you like to see?" I led them to the workshop. When we reached the bottom of the stairs, I flipped on the lights, and Clara gasped. The Victorian dollhouse sat in the center of the workbench, restored to full glory. "It is for me," Clara whispered. "It is for you," I confirmed, lifting her up. "But the magic does not happen until you flip the switch." I guided her small finger to the tiny brass louver. She pressed it with a satisfying click, and every window blazed to life with warm, golden light. Clara squealed with delight, but I gently stopped her. "Before you play, little bird, there is something special hidden inside. I want you to find it." She carefully opened the miniature attic door and pulled out the photograph, Margaret holding baby Beatrice. "Who is this, Grandpa?" "That is your grandmother, Margaret. She would have loved you so much, and that baby is your mommy." Clara studied the photograph, then looked at Beatrice, who was openly crying. "Mommy, you look happy." I was happy, sweet girl, because Grandma and Grandpa Elias loved me so much. Just like we love you. As Clara explored the dollhouse, Beatrice looked around at the tools, the photographs of Margaret I had never taken down. "This is where I should have brought her years ago. Better late than never, Beatrice. But we are here now." She turned to me. "Leonora offered me a position as Community Outreach Director for Vance Holdings. It is honest work, Dad. Connecting their projects with neighborhoods like Bridgeport. That sounds like work your mother would have been proud of." "It is work I am proud of," she corrected gently. As the December sun set, Clara looked up at me with those wise Margaret blue eyes. "Grandpa Elias, will you teach me how to make the lights work?" I lifted her onto my lap. "Little bird, I will teach you everything I know. As long as I am around, I promise you the lights will never go out. 3 days later, I stood in my Bridgeport dining room doorway, watching my table surrounded by people who had once tried to erase me. The smell of roasting turkey filled the house, a scent Margaret had perfected over 3 decades. This year, for the first time since she died, I was not cooking for ghosts. Beatrice moved around the kitchen, while Clara sat coloring a thankful tree. I watched my granddaughter write in crooked letters, Grandpa Elias and the lighthouse. The doorbell rang at 2 p.m. Standing on my porch, looking profoundly uncomfortable, were Meredith and Richard Sinclair. Meredith clutched a store-bought pie with awkward uncertainty. Elias Richard said, "Thank you for inviting us." I stepped aside to let them enter. "I am glad you came. Margaret always said Thanksgiving was about the honesty you brought to the table." Meredith's eyes filled with tears. "Elias, I owe you an apology that words can barely express. I convinced my son that people like you were beneath us. I destroyed my own family with my arrogance. The past is done, Meredith. But if you are at my table today, you live by Thorn rules. We speak the truth. We treat people with respect. And we remember that a man who works with his hands is just as valuable as anyone else." We moved to the dining room, and I took my place at the head of the table. Richard sat at the opposite end, Beatrice on my right, Clara on my left. The symbolism was clear. The electrician from Bridgeport was finally acknowledged as the foundation of this family. As we passed dishes, Clara asked if she could say grace. "Thank you, God, for Grandpa Elias, who fixes things. Thank you for Mommy, who is learning to be brave. Thank you for the dollhouse with the lights. And thank you that families can be broken and then fixed again, just like Grandpa's circuits. Amen." The meal was not perfect, but it was real honest and ours. After dinner, Meredith approached me with an envelope. "This is not payment or charity, Elias. It is an investment. Richard and I want to fund a scholarship for trade school students. We want to call it the Margaret Thorne Memorial Scholarship, if you will allow it." My wife would have loved that. After they left, my phone buzzed with a text from Beatrice's dad. "Thank you for today. Clara asked if we could have lunch tomorrow, just the 3 of us. She wants to hear stories about Mom. I have so many questions I never asked. I love you. I am sorry it took me so long to remember what really matters." I typed back, "Tomorrow at noon. I will make your mother's lasagna, and B, I love you too." I have never stopped. I looked around my house, the worn furniture, the honest walls, the foundation that had held firm. A man's worth is not measured by the height of the building he stands in, but by the strength of the foundation he builds for those who come after. The legacy was in the light I had kept burning so that the people I loved would always be able to find their way home. The smell of roasting turkey and pine needles filled the Bridgeport kitchen, but the most intoxicating scent was the lack of fear, the quiet, steady humming of a life finally back in phase. I stood by the stove, watching the steam rise from the gravy, feeling the light weight of the house keys in my pocket. They felt different now. The interest Leonora had added to my returned retirement fund hadn't just put me back in the black. It had been enough to pay off the mortgage on this old house entirely. I was finally the absolute owner of my domain, and for the first time in years, the walls didn't feel like they were closing in on a debt I couldn't pay. Beatrice was standing at the counter, no longer draped in Gold Coast silk, or looking at me through a filter of social shame. She wore a simple wool sweater and was helping me mash the potatoes, her phone sitting untouched and silent on the charging dock. Clara sat at the table humming a song as she colored a picture of a house with glowing yellow windows. "I forgot how good this house smells when the oven's been on all day," Beatrice said, her voice soft and lacking the clinical edge that had once defined it. "It smells like home bee," I replied, stirring the pot with a steady hand. "That is a flavor you can't cater. Legacy isn't about the name on the building. It is about whose hands people call for when the sky goes dark." The conversation at the table was easy, flowing around stories of the old neighborhood, and the progress of the young engineers in my apprenticeship program. We didn't talk about venture capital disruption or the hollow metrics of a life built on speculation. After dinner, a courier arrived with a special delivery from Leonora Vance. I opened the package to find the latest issue of Modern Grid and Infrastructure, the most respected trade magazine in the country. The glossy cover reflected the twinkling lights of the Christmas tree, showing a stark, dignified photo of me in my workshop. The headline read, "Master of the Grid: Why the Future of Smart Cities Depends on Manual Mastery." The article positioned me as the gold standard of the industry, detailing the rescue of the apex as a triumph of experience over arrogance. The magazine glossy was smooth, but my hands were still rough. That is the proper way for the world to work. "Look at you, Dad," Beatrice whispered, her eyes shining as she traced the letters of my name. "You're a hero in their world now." "No, B," I said, feeling a profound sense of justice. "I'm just an electrician who stayed on the ladder long enough to see the view." As we turned the page, I saw a small sidebar that acted as the final closing of a circuit. It mentioned Julian Sinclair by name, not as an innovator, but as a cautionary case study of catastrophic leadership failure. He had become a ghost story for business schools, a warning of what happens when vanity outpaces integrity. I closed the magazine and looked at the empty chair where Margaret should have been, then at the girl who carried her smile. I knew then that the Sinclairs hadn't just lost their money. They had lost the only thing that mattered. I had my name back, my home back, and most importantly, I had the truth back. I looked at the snow falling thick and quiet outside the window, knowing I had one last job to do before the year ended. The snow at the cemetery was undisturbed, a white blanket over the only person I ever truly wanted to impress. And as I knelt by Margaret's headstone, the cold ground felt like the first solid thing I'd touched in years. I used my gloved hand to clear the frost from her marker, the granite cold and uncompromising beneath my fingers. My breath hitched as I saw a small, fresh bouquet of winter jasmine resting against the base of the stone, Margaret's favorite. Beatrice had been here secretly before me to offer an apology I knew she couldn't yet say to my face. It was a sign that the circuit wasn't just repaired. It was beginning to hold a real charge again. I reached into my coat and pulled out the issue of Modern Grid and Infrastructure. I tucked it into a clear plastic sleeve and placed it firmly against the stone, a final report for the woman who had been my North Star. I kept the promise, Margaret, I whispered into the biting south side wind. I didn't let her world stay dark even when she tried to hide mine. I told her everything: the rescue of Leonora, the reclamation of our home, and the way Clara looks at me with eyes that match hers. Granite doesn't argue. It just listens. It's the best audience a man like me could ask for. I admitted my own failures, the moments I let the slow fade make me feel like a ghost instead of the master I was. But the light in the thorn house is burning steady again, Margaret. Clara has your chin and your stubbornness. She's going to be just fine. I stood up, the crunch of fresh snow under my heavy work boots, sounding like the closing of a heavy book. As the sun began to set on 2025, casting long purple shadows over the graves, I walked back to my truck. The distant skyline of Chicago began to twinkle with New Year's Eve celebrations, a million souls preparing for a new start. The city was a circuit board of a million souls, and for the first time, I wasn't just a resistor, I was the current. I looked toward the horizon and saw the red aviation lights of the apex flashing rhythmically. It was no longer a symbol of my exclusion or Julian's vanity. It was a beacon of my own handiwork, a grid I had stabilized when it mattered most. I climbed into the cab and saw a notification on my phone. My first royalty check from the Vance training patent had just cleared a sum that made my old overtime shifts look like pocket change. Simultaneously, a news alert scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Julian Sinclair had officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, his name finally scrubbed from the city he tried to own. "Happy New Year, Margaret," I said, starting the engine. "Watch over us." I felt a sense of quiet, absolute power, knowing I was finally the master of my own internal grid. I pulled out of the cemetery gates and headed toward the warm lights of Bridgeport. I knew that even if the whole world went dark tonight, I'd still know exactly how to find my way home. The legacy was safe, the debt was paid, and the master was finally at peace. A man's worth isn't measured by the height of the building he stands in, but by whether he has the strength to keep the lights on for those still waiting in the basement. I stood in my quiet Bridgeport workshop on the first morning of the new year, watching the moonlight reflect off the clean, organized rows of tools that had saved a life and a legacy. As I reached for my heavy steel toolbox, I found a small, crinkled piece of paper tucked under the handle. It was a thank you drawing from Clara showing me with a flowing red cape and a massive wrench. She didn't care about the Lake Forest penthouse or the designer watches. She saw the hero who knew how to fix the broken things. It was the most honest appraisal I had received in 40 years. I took a deep breath, the lingering scent of cedar and floor wax acting as a balm for my tired lungs. I began to take a final inventory of the life I had fought to reclaim. I reflected on the vast difference between Julian's perceived value and the actual load of a man's character. The Sinclairs had built a world on a series of open circuits beautiful to look at, but incapable of carrying a current. My life, though scarred by the slow fade and repaired with the grease of a dozen late nights, was finally grounded in the truth. I picked up my master electrician's license, the paper crisp and official, and placed it on the wall in a simple frame next to the photograph of Margaret. "You were right, Margaret." I whispered, my voice thick with a profound sense of integration. "The foundation is everything. If the wiring in the heart isn't right, the rest of the house doesn't stand a chance." I thought of Beatrice and Julian, now stripped of their borrowed prestige, facing the silence of their modest condo. In the end, we are all just conductors for the light we choose to carry, and their lines had simply burned out. I ran my calloused fingers over the smooth, cold metal of the master switch I had installed for the workshop's new sub-panel. It clicked into place with a reassuring, heavy thud. Upstairs, I could hear the steady, rhythmic hum of the house's furnace, a sound that spoke of warmth and stability. The world outside was cold, but the grid inside these walls was perfect. I received a final digital notification on my tablet from Leonora Vance's legal team. They were finalizing the new maintenance protocols for the entire Apex complex. Every high-rise in her portfolio would now be governed by a strict set of manual first standards, ensuring that no digital ghost could ever leave a tenant in the dark again. The protocol wasn't listed by a corporate code or a technical acronym. It was officially named the Thorn Standard. It was a legacy that didn't require a name in gold on the lobby wall. It was a legacy that lived in the safety of the people inside. I looked at the shadow of my tools on the floor, feeling a peace that went deeper than money or titles. I had fixed the building, I had fixed the trust for my granddaughter, and most importantly, I had fixed the man in the mirror. I turned off the workshop light, the darkness no longer feeling like a tomb. But as I walked upstairs, the warmth of the house told me the power would never go out again. Looking back now, I realized this was never just about money, pride, or a broken relationship. This entire family story forced me to face a painful truth about myself. I believed that if I worked harder, sacrificed more, and gave everything to my daughter, love would naturally follow. But love cannot survive when it is built only on sacrifice and silence. If you are listening to this family story, I want to tell you something. Honestly, do not disappear from your own life the way I did. For years, I kept forgiving, kept giving, and kept hoping things would change. Many people might call what happened to me a dad revenge, but the truth is more complicated. My dad revenge was never about destroying my daughter or humiliating those who hurt me. It was about finally standing up for my dignity. Sometimes the greatest dad revenge is simply refusing to let others decide your worth. If there is one lesson in this family story, it is this: never confuse love with self-erasure. A parent can give everything and still lose their family if respect disappears. Do not wait until you are broken to protect your dignity. Set boundaries early, speak truth early, and never be ashamed of honest work. I also believe that God allowed this journey to happen so I could learn that character matters far more than status. So if you take anything from this family story, remember that strength is not measured by how much pain you endure silently, but by the courage to keep your light on when others try to put it out. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. Please leave a comment and share your thoughts. What would you do if you were in Elias's position? Facing that same impossible choice between dignity and family, I would truly value hearing your perspective. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you do not miss future videos. A small note: while this narrative draws inspiration from real-world themes and social situations, some elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this kind of content is not what you usually enjoy, feel free to explore other videos that may suit your interests better.